So we're continuing on in our second unit, and so far we've looked at two views, right? We've looked at Mill's view and we looked at Kant's view. I told you at the start of this unit that pretty much all the thinkers, at least these first three thinkers that we're looking at, agree that there is some kind of fact of the matter about what's right and wrong. One of the phrases I used last time when we were talking about Kant is he thinks there's an objective standard of right and wrong that we're all beholden to. Well, how did these different thinkers explain that? What did they think that hinges upon? Mill thought it had to do with the consequences of our actions. He put forth a utilitarian view in which he argued that when we're trying to figure out how we should live or what's right or wrong, we should look at the consequences our actions produce. Namely, whether our actions are raising the happiness levels in the universe, making people more well off, healthier, all that stuff. But Kant had a different view. Kant said that no, the morality of an action isn't determined by its consequences, and it's not determined by your goal. It's determined by the principle that you're acting from and what your motivation is for action, right? For him, if you're doing what you think is a good thing because you're trying to get money or you're trying to expand your brand or it makes you feel good, that kind of cheapens your action a little bit. And so for Kant, he said to do the 100% moral thing, you got to do it just because you recognize that's the right thing to do. And so to oversimplify, if we call Mill's view consequentialist, the morality of an action is based on its consequences, we could say Kant's view says the morality of somebody's action is based on their intention. Well, today we're looking at a thinker who provides a different answer to this question. What makes an action moral or immoral? But I think what we have when we look at Aristotle is a theory not just about that, but also about how to get there and what the relationship is between being a good person and living a happy, healthy life. So Aristotle is going to say, just to provide a brief preview, that what makes an action right or wrong has to do with virtue. It has to do with your thoughts, your responses to action, your dispositions, what you do in the world, all of these things wrapped up together. For Kant, he thought that being moral and doing the right thing should take priority over our own happiness. So a lot of people think like this, right? They put doing good things at the top of their hierarchy of life and priorities, right? You should be a good person above all, a moral person. In some sense, Aristotle's going to agree with that, but he's going to say, actually, if you're being a good person and you're doing right things and you are walking down that path, there isn't a firm separation between being good and being happy. Aristotle thinks that achieving a happy life, a flourishing life, is actually, it goes along with being a good person and doing right things. So we're not going to see the same kind of split that we saw in Kant. Now, Aristotle was an ancient Greek philosopher. He's somebody who wrote on a wide range of issues, including metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, social and political philosophy. This is a guy who has been incredibly influential in Western history, the development of Western philosophy, etc. Notably, he was one of Plato's students. And though he disagreed with Plato on a lot of things, he and Plato, you could say, constructed the foundations of a lot of the views that we're looking at in this class and a lot of the ways that we think about things today. Historically, for example, Catholic theology in a lot of different sects is deeply Aristotelian. Why? Well, in the Middle Ages, Thomas Aquinas ended up producing this massive theological work that was deeply influenced by the philosophy of Aristotle. So within the realm of Christianity, we see Aristotle's influence. Within the realm of ethics, within the realm of social and political philosophy. So this is a really important guy that we're looking at today. But, as you'll see, he doesn't present this crazy, difficult to understand philosophy of life. In contrast to the very difficult view that we looked at by Kant last time, I think you're going to find that Aristotle's view is very commonsensical, rational, and I think you'll find that you already believe a lot of the things that he says in the work that we're looking at today already. One more note. He was also the personal tutor of Alexander the Great. So this guy is not somebody who's just a footnote in our history. He rubbed shoulders with very important people and has a profound impact on how we think and speak and act still today. I asked you to read just one chapter of Aristotle's seminal book on ethics, the Nicomachean Ethics. Well, what exactly is he doing in this book? He's trying to provide a philosophy of life for us. Not just a theory about what makes an action right or wrong, but how to achieve a happy, healthy, flourishing life. What some philosophers have called the good life. In this way, we could say that this work is different from the last two works that we've read. Whereas Mill and Kant were focused on the question of what makes an action right or wrong, Aristotle is going to tackle that question, but he's also going to try to provide an answer for how do we become good people and what makes a life good? How can we attain that ourselves? One of his foundational ideas is that being a good person is not divorced from the happy, flourishing life. He's going to say, if you follow his ethical guidelines here, not only will you become a moral person and do moral things, but you'll also be happy, you'll be healthy, you'll become a better version of yourself for yourself and others. And therefore, hopefully, through your actions and your speech, you can help make society a better place to live in too. There is a view that is fairly common among contemporary philosophy and just society broadly that says if you know what the right thing to do is, you're capable of being a good person. Aristotle does not completely agree with this. In Aristotle's philosophy, there's a distinction between knowing what the right thing to do is and actually doing it. And you already know this, right? You know that tonight you should not watch 7 episodes of Down for Love instead of doing your homework, right? You know that you shouldn't lay in bed all weekend and not go to the gym, but you do that anyway, right? And so do I. So, another one of the foundational ideas that Aristotle's philosophy is going to be built on today is having ethical knowledge is not enough to make you a good person. And it's not going to be enough to make you happy and achieve a flourishing life. To do that, we have to engage in certain actions, and we have to reform our own characters so that we naturally think, speak, and act in the proper ways that are conducive for our own happiness and the happiness of other people. Thus, he's going to say, this is going to be a big theme in today's investigation, that both instruction, ethical knowledge, and habituation, living in the proper way, establishing the proper habits and the proper mindsets, are going to be required for living the good life, or becoming moral, becoming happy, etc. What this is going to require is that we work on ourselves, that we change some of the mindsets and the attitudes that we have, that we reform some of the responses that we have when people do things that we don't like or say things that we don't like. This is not going to be able to be achieved by just scrolling on your phone for the rest of your life, or mindlessly consuming music, movie, TV shows, or anything like that. Aristotle is going to insist upon that if you want to become a happy person, if you want to become a good person, that's something that you're going to have to work at. It's going to be a long process. It's going to take a lot of time and energy, but it's worth doing. And so another idea that we see in Aristotle's philosophy, which is reflected back at us, is, well, our own inconsistencies and vices that we should be working on. Because we all know at the end of the day that we are not all that we can be. We are not all that we should be. And so one way that you could interpret Aristotle's philosophy here is not just a descriptive analysis of these things, but also a call to action. A call for you to work on yourself and become more just and honest, loving, and witty, as we'll see. So for Aristotle, the good life, which is moral, happy, healthy, is going to be wrapped up in some kind of life of activity, of doing stuff, of being out there in the world and doing things. To encapsulate this, then, we could say Aristotle's ethical theory is going to center around self-improvement, working on ourselves, strengthening our capacities, and making ourselves into the kinds of people that naturally do good, happy, healthy things. That is why kind of at the beginning of this lecture I've been calling it a philosophy of life. It's not just a view on, what should I do in this particular situation. What Aristotle is going to provide in this piece is a general sketch of how to achieve that thing that we're all looking for. Human flourishing, a flourishing life. Any questions so far? Okay, we'll continue on then. Aristotle's book, the Nicomachean Ethics, begins by kind of laying out the problem that faces us as human beings. Namely, what is our life oriented towards? Is it oriented towards the right thing? How do we know that? How can we get there? How should we treat ourselves and treat other people in order to achieve this thing called happiness? Well, we'll get into the argument a little bit later, but he grounds this in what he calls the function of a human being. Due to the fact that we have these capacities and abilities, he's going to say that there are things that we ought to be doing in order to exercise those things and which are going to be good for us. The view that he puts forth, which has been modified and critiqued and summarized and investigated in the history of philosophy is called virtue theory. It's the view that the morality of an action is determined by the degree to which that action proceeds from one or more of the virtues. In other words, what Aristotle is going to say is you can't just do good things willy-nilly whenever the situation presents itself. I mean, logically you can, but that's not how things go. In order to do good things, you kind of have to make yourself a good person. So again, we see this idea that ethical knowledge is not enough. Knowledge of what we're supposed to do and how we're supposed to live is not sufficient for us to get there. There's work that needs to be done. There are things that we need to consider. And I think his life philosophy is well captured in this little diagram here. The principles that you have are going to guide your actions in society, in this life. What action does is it gives you experience. Experience in, how to interact with others, the kinds of decisions that you should be making, whether something is good or bad for you, right? Just pay attention to how it strikes you, what results from the situation you're in. If you're smart and if you're compelled to actually try to achieve this thing called happiness, you'll reflect on those experiences. Those reflections will help you refine the values that you have, what you want to get out of life, which then end up informing your principles for action, and around the circle we go. So, the overarching idea is this. If we're going to become good moral people, if we're going to become happy and healthy, we need to engage in a process like this, which includes action, experience, reflection, oriented towards, what we do and how we are living. So Aristotle's making a lot of claims here, right? First, we have the claim that the moral life is somehow connected to the happy life. We have the claim that if we know what the right thing to do is, that's not enough just to be a good person. We have the claim that if we know how we're supposed to live, that's not sufficient for actually getting us to live the way that we want to, and that's good for us. And at bottom, we have this claim that, how are we supposed to live? It's going to have something to do with changing how we're living right now. And I think you intuitively recognize that, although it can often be an uncomfortable truth to wrestle with. So, Aristotle and we're not going to be shaming anybody here. What we're going to be doing is investigating the guidelines that he provides that's going to help you achieve this thing that you all want. Happiness. Now, what exactly is happiness? What does it mean for a human being to be happy? How do we get there? Well, Aristotle provides an analysis and an argument for this. He starts off by making the following claim. All pursuits or activities aim at some end or goal. So, for example, let's say you engage in the activity of catching and taming horses. Why would you do that? Well, sometimes you have a further goal that you're trying to achieve, right? Why do you catch and tame a horse? Maybe you need a horse for your ranch. Or maybe you plan to use it in war. Or maybe you just like horses. Our pursuits and our activities are not empty. We're engaging in them for one of two reasons. Either we're trying to do that thing to reach some further goal. This would be an example of an instrumental activity. You study so that you can get a good grade. That's your higher goal. Your goal isn't the studying in itself. But we also engage in activities called intrinsic activities. Activities that we engage in simply because it provides us with some sort of joy or happiness. Like listening to music. You're not listening to music to make money. You're listening to music because you enjoy it. It brings you happiness. All activities are like this. And if we get to the bottom of trying to figure out what we're doing and why we're doing it, we'll realize that fundamentally we're all chasing after the same thing. Why would somebody need to tame and rear horses? Well, maybe it's because they need a horse for their ranch. Why do they need a horse for their ranch? It's so that the ranch can run smoothly and so they can get work done. Why does somebody want the ranch to run smoothly and the work to get done? So that they can be happy and so that they can enjoy life. At bottom, Aristotle is going to say, all our activities are ultimately aimed at achieving this thing called happiness. That is why you do what you do. Why are you in this class? So that you can get credit. Why do you want to get credit? So you can get your degree. Why do you want to get your degree? So you can get a job. Why do you want to be able to have a job and make money? So you can feed yourself and provide for yourself and be happy and, right, do all that. So there is some end or goal at which all our activities aim. Aristotle is going to say, for humans, that is this thing called eudaimonia. I've been throwing this word happiness around. A better translation of it would be flourishing. Why? Well, the way that we think about happiness nowadays is not the same way that Aristotle is thinking about it. What do you think happiness is? Is it just a mental state that you fall in and out of based on the circumstances? If that's what you think happiness is, you're never going to be able to attain that forever, right? Some days you'll be sad, some days you'll be happy, some days you'll be angry. You'll have it one moment, the next moment it'll be gone. You'll be seeking after this thing that you can't ever really get a firm hold on for the rest of your life. That's not how Aristotle conceives of happiness or human flourishing, eudaimonia. For him, happiness isn't a mental state. It consists in some sort of active life of doing things, where we're exercising our capacities, where we are in relationship with other people, where we're pursuing goals and getting stuff done. So Aristotle is not going to have the same conception of happiness that we do. It's not a mental state. It's not a feeling. It's a kind of life. A kind of life in which you are flourishing. That is what he means here. He says, so if what is done has some end that we want for its own sake, and everything else we want is for the sake of this end, and if we do not choose everything for the sake of something else, because this would lead to an infinite regress, he says progression here, making our desire fruitless and vain, then clearly this will be the good, indeed the chief good. Surely then knowledge of the good must be very important for our lives. And if, like archers, we have a target, are we not more likely to hit the right mark? If so, we must try at least roughly to comprehend what the good is and which science or faculty is concerned with it. So I think you would all agree that you're chasing after happiness. That's what you ultimately want. But what this quote invites us to question is, do we have the proper conception of happiness? Is our life oriented towards the right thing that is going to get us that? If we don't know what happiness is or how to get it, we're not going to be able to achieve that. So he's going to try to outline an argument and an analysis in which he makes this known or makes it apparent. Knowledge of the good would seem to be the concern of the most authoritative science, the highest master science. And this is obviously the science of politics, because it lays down which of the sciences there should be in cities, and which each class of person should learn and up to what level. Since political science employs the other sciences and also lays down laws about what we should do and refrain from, its end will include the ends of the others, and will therefore be the human good. Our inquiry, then, is a kind of political science, since these are the ends it is aiming at. Now, he's using a different kind of conception that we have of political science here. Right? When you think of political science, you think of taking dry classes where you talk about communist theory and capitalism and that kind of stuff. But what Aristotle is trying to make us aware of in this quote is that how we do things in our societies, the laws that we have, the principles that we follow, practically come down to a matter of how we've organized our societies and our relationships. In some sense, it is politics that determines, or influences at least, what gets taught in the classroom. What parents are allowed to teach their kids. What is allowed to be done in society. What values we should hold. All of these things are related to, well, how do we construct our lives and live in relationship with others in these communities? Which is why he says if we're going to be looking for happiness, we need to look into political science to find that. If you want to think about this along slightly different lines, Marx is famous for saying that it is the material conditions of society that have an impact on what your values are, what your goals are, what you're allowed to do, what your conception is of happiness, all of that stuff. In other words, do you have access to resources or not? Do you control the resources or not? What kind of class and family did you grow up in? The idea is somewhat similar here. If we're going to try to figure out how to live, we need to make some sort of inquiry into, well, what we've been taught, how we organize ourselves, and whether that stuff has been built on the proper foundation. People have different conceptions of happiness, right? I think we can all agree, largely, that we're all after happiness. Is there anyone here that doesn't want to be happy? No, you all want to be happy, right? So, okay, humans tend to agree that that's what we're after, that's what we're trying to achieve. But what exactly is that? How does one attain happiness? What is that thing? Well, Aristotle goes through a few different examples. Would you be happy if you had all the money in the world? You might think money would solve a lot of my problems, right? No doubt. Money would solve a lot of my problems too. But is wealth sufficient to make you happy? If you have wealth, does that make you happy? What do you think?
I feel like in ways it can just cause more issues.
Okay, yeah. Are you thinking of like lottery winners who are bankrupt like 3 years down the line and they have terrible lives
Yeah.
after winning $400 million? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, think about how, if you know any rich people, think about their lives, or if you've seen depictions of rich people in movies and TV shows, are they happy, peaceful people? A lot of times they're striving for more, they can never get enough, they don't feel peace in their heart. Happiness might help us acquire happiness. Wealth might help us acquire happiness, but happiness is not to be found just in that. How about pleasure? Do you think happiness is pleasure? If you experience just never-ending pleasure for the rest of your life, do you think that would be sufficient for happiness? By pleasure here, he's talking kind of like sensuous pleasures, the bodily pleasures. I hook you up, I give you all the money in the world, you can buy all the Molly that you want, do all the candy flips that you want, you can go to the club whenever you want, drink as much as you want whenever you want, all the pleasure in the world, all the best rugs and clothes. Is that going to make you happy?
I think it goes along with like wanting more, like constantly, and like you're gonna get tired of that. It's not gonna be special.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
you build a tolerance and things like that.
So, would you say then that pleasure is not the same as happiness? The rest of y'all agree? Aristotle's going to say wealth is not happiness. That's not sufficient for the flourishing life. Pleasure is not happiness. Happiness is not sufficient for the flourishing life. He provides a different reason, though, an interesting reason. He says the life of pleasure is not fit for human beings. That's what beasts and animals chase after. In some sense, we are called to engage in higher things, to do more meaningful things. How about honor? Would you be happy if everybody honored you and respected you? Is honor happiness? I see some shaking of heads. Why not? Why don't you think honor is happiness? Wouldn't you be happy if everybody treated you like you were a god? Why not?
Because like we kind of need like worse feelings to really like appreciate when things feel good. Like if you constantly felt good, you would never have a feeling to compare it to.
Yeah. Yeah, that Nietzsche actually makes a similar point in his book Beyond Good and Evil. He says that joy and sorrow are twins. They grow or diminish together. And his point is very similar to yours. If you never go through any suffering or bad experiences, you can't experience true joy. You have nothing to compare it with, no standard or basis to evaluate those experiences from. Aristotle's going to provide a different argument as to why he thinks honor is not happiness. He's going to say, well, you should think about this a little bit harder. The thing that we are trying to make explicit here, what happiness is something that he has shown, and that we all agree, is choosable for its own sake. It's good in and of itself. If we achieve this thing called happiness or flourishing, We're not trying to achieve that for something else down the line. We just want it in and of itself, because in and of itself it's a good thing. He says, why do people chase after honor? Well, they chase after honor because they want something further. They don't chase after honor for its own sake. They chase after honor because they think honor is going to bring them happiness or good experiences or whatever. So, insofar as people chase honor, they're not chasing it in and of itself. That disqualifies it from being happiness, because happiness is supposed to be this thing we're chasing for itself, because it is good in itself. No, wealth, pleasure, honor, these things are not identical with happiness. They might help you on your journey to happiness, but they're not the same thing as happiness. What we're ultimately after, he thinks, is a flourishing life. Eudaimonia. This is the word that he uses for it. What we're ultimately after is this thing that is self-sufficient. So if we acquired it, we wouldn't want for anything else. Choosable for its own sake. It's good in and of itself. It is the highest goal towards which our lives are aimed. And it lacks nothing. Achieving this thing would be sufficient for you to be happy and flourishing. This eudaimonia. Okay, so what have we established? We've established that wealth, honor, and pleasure are not the same as happiness. We've established that we are all ultimately seeking after this thing called flourishing, human flourishing. Well, the next question then becomes, how do we get there? What exactly is the nature of this human flourishing, and how do we get there? Well, it has something to do with what we are like as human beings. In other words, what Aristotle is going to propose is to achieve a flourishing life, we need to pay attention to certain facts about the kinds of creatures that we are. Pigs, for example, they don't sweat, right? So in order to cool them off, you need to provide them with a nice puddle of mud or something. Would it be good for your hamster if you provided them with a puddle of mud? Probably not, right? Hamsters don't need puddles of mud to cool off or to regulate their body temperature. They'd be dirty and messy all the time. Or think about a more extreme case. How about a chinchilla? Should you put a nice puddle of mud and a bunch of water at the bottom of your chinchilla's cage? No, chinchillas are not supposed to get wet. Okay, it'll mess them up. That's why they take dust baths to clean themselves. So if we look into what a human being is, the nature of a human being, that'll give us some sort of clue as to how we can achieve a flourishing life for ourselves. You could think about it like this. What makes a good hammer? If we're trying to answer the question of a human being, let's use an example. What makes a good hammer? Does a hammer paint well? Is that what makes a good hammer, if it paints well? If it produces melodic sounds, is that what makes a good hammer? No, what makes a good hammer? Yeah, it has to hammer things well, right? Would this be a good hammer? No, how am I going to get a nail into a piece of wood with this flimsy plastic crap? What makes a good pen? Or pencil? Writing instrument? What do you think?
If it's smooth, you got like a good smooth pen.
You could say maybe it writes well, right? A good writing instrument is one that writes well. What makes a good mug? It holds liquids well, right? And maybe keeps the liquids at a particular temperature. Maybe that's part of a thermos too. Aristotle thinks we can figure out what the flourishing life is going to be for human beings by looking at the kinds of things we are and what our function is. His view is what philosophers call teleological. Things in the universe all have a function. What makes a good table? You can rest things on it well. What makes a good clock? It tells time well. That's its function. What makes a good wall? It holds up the building well and separates, room from room well. What makes a good violinist? That they play the cello bad? No, what makes somebody a good violinist? They can play the violin well, right? Exactly. Yeah. What we see when we look at examples like this and we think about this commonsensically is that what is good for a thing is for that thing to perform its function well. A good laptop, laptops well. A good cheetah, cheetahs well. So if we're going to figure out what's good for a human being, what's going to allow us to achieve a flourishing life, we need to ask ourselves, well, what's the function of a human being? And Aristotle tries to provide an answer for this. He thinks that in order to figure this out, we should look at what separates us from other things that exist. We're similar to animals, right? Perhaps more similar to animals than we are to inanimate objects. Well, what would be a good thing for a beaver? A good thing for a beaver would be able to dam well. It would be able to reproduce well. It would be able to eat and poop well. All that stuff, right? The biological processes. Humans do that stuff too. I mean, we don't build dams like beavers do with our teeth, but we do that stuff too. But there's one thing that separates us apart from the other creatures. What is that thing? We've kind of brought it up a few times already in class. What can humans do that animals can't? Yeah. We can think, right? We have this ability to reflect, to think, to plan, to engage in logical analysis. As far as we know, animals can't do that. Okay, so that is a part of our nature. We have a mind or a consciousness that can engage in rational activity. This difference, Aristotle says, is going to clue us into what is going to be good for human beings. What separates us from animals is that we can think and act rationally. And in some sense, what's good for a thing is for that thing to exercise its powers well. What makes a good dog? It does dog stuff well. What makes a good human being? It's going to human well. And part of that is going to involve rational activity, using our mind in a certain way. And thus we get to an answer to our question. What makes a human being good? What would be good for a human being? What is going to allow us to achieve a flourishing life? It's going to have to do with exercising our capacities in a certain way, and more specifically, our capacities for reflection, rational analysis, that mind stuff. And so he says, the human good, that is, eudaimonia or flourishing, is an activity of the soul expressing complete virtue in a complete lifetime. Or to quote him, happiness or flourishing is a kind of living well and acting well. Now, by the word soul here, we don't mean like Christian immortal soul that goes to heaven when you die. What we're invoking is the Greek word nous. This is where we get the word pneumatic from. A nous is like a mind or a consciousness. So, what's good for a human being? That they engage in an activity of the mind or consciousness which expresses complete virtue. Virtue is another word for excellence from the ancient Greek, in a complete lifetime. In other words, what's good for a human being, what's going to make us happy, is that we do human stuff excellently, which includes using our consciousness in a particular way. This isn't a passive lifestyle of endless, empty consumption. The flourishing life is a life of activity in which we're doing stuff and employing our human capacities. That's what it's going to be all about. We're not there yet, though. Do you express complete excellence in all that you do? Do you use your mind in the way that it should be used always? No. Nobody does. Or maybe a handful of people do. I don't know. And so what this is going to imply is, if this is true, we have to change how we're thinking and acting a little bit. Because we're falling short of the ideal here. We're falling short of using our minds in a particular way that is completely excellent across our lives. So how do we do that? How do we get there? Well, there are going to be a number of requirements for that. A number of activities that we should engage in. If we want to be good, happy, healthy people, he's going to say we need to cultivate the virtues. This is a word that you don't hear that much nowadays, right? Maybe if you grew up reading the King James Bible, you will have seen this word, the virtues, the spiritual virtues. What are examples of the virtues, do you think? Somebody says, oh yeah, they have that virtue. What would be an example of that? Well, we can use biblical examples. Patience is a virtue. Generosity is a virtue. Compassion, love is a virtue. Honesty. Moderation. Not eating 12 plates of food at Thanksgiving so that you're so full and you feel like you're going to die. but maybe, stopping after 2. It's not going too hard into something. Yeah, these would be examples of virtues. We're not born with these things. We're not born expressing love all the time to people, or expressing honesty or generosity, or being moderate in our actions. It's something that we have to work on and cultivate ourselves. How do we do that? Well, we do that by reforming our character, by changing how we think about things, how we respond to things, and changing how we act in the world. What a virtue basically is a certain disposition. Or, to use another word, a tendency. Aristotle's saying if we want to achieve the good life, we need to develop certain tendencies. To feel the proper emotions and act the proper way, at the proper time, toward the proper people, with the proper intensity, from the proper motive. That's the kind of character that we should try to construct for ourselves. So, for example, if I lend you my Nickelback CD, and you're like, this sucks. Nickelback is the worst. I fucking hate Nickelback. This music is trash, Professor Gunner. And you snap the CD and then you hand it back to me. If my response is, you broke my Nickelback CD? I'm going to kill you and your family. Is that the proper response? No, right? You'd say, Professor Gunner, are you insane? Do we need to hospitalize you? That is not an appropriate reaction to that, right? Or how about this? You really hate me because I gave you a B instead of an A on one of your papers. And so you cut my brake lines on my car. And I almost die. If I hop out of the car and I see you standing there and I'm like, oh, no big deal. You cut my brake lines, whatever. Is that the proper response to that? No, I should be more upset at you, right? Maybe I should give you a stern talking to, I don't know, about how you don't cut people's brake lines, and that's fucked up. So there is a proper way to respond to the situations that life throws at us, emotionally, intellectually, and through action. What we just went through in those examples was an example of this, reacting with the proper intensity. Or how about this? We can talk about this one. Feeling the proper emotions and acting the proper way at the proper time. There are kind of like 3 things here, but yeah.
I read the book The Passions for another psych class, and because what I would do, I would like downplay emotions, and I'd be like, oh, I'm not upset at this or whatever.
Yeah.
And then in the book I was reading, like, whoever the author was, they were saying like you're full of feel this emotion about something. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Aristotle's going to agree. He's going to say it's proper to feel certain emotions in certain circumstances. When your boyfriend cheats on you, is the proper emotion happiness and joy? No, you should feel a sense of sadness and betrayal, right? Would it be proper to experience sadness and betrayal 30 years after that happened? No, that's not the proper time to express that emotion. You express the emotion, you feel it after it happens, and then the proper thing to do is slowly over time, you get better, you become more secure and happy, and so on, right? So, we need to work on ourselves so that we have the proper emotional reactions to things. We need to work on ourselves so that we respond to those situations in the proper way. When you break my Nickelback CD, the proper response is not me torturing you for 3 days and killing your sister. Okay? doing and feeling these things at the proper time is also part of this too. And psychology knows this, right? If you bottle up emotions and you don't process them, and if you don't allow yourself to process certain experiences that you've had, what ends up happening? You become traumatized because you didn't work through that. These actions and responses need to be directed toward the right people. If you're mad that I gave you a B on an assignment, it doesn't make sense that you go and cut Donald Trump's brake lines for that reason. No, you should maybe be upset at me, right? Because I'm the one that did you wrong, you think. And we also need to work on ourselves to cultivate the proper intentions or motives for our actions. Human beings do things for certain reasons. You should do things for proper reasons. You should have the proper intentions when you go into a particular situation. Your intention should not be to screw yourself over. That would be irrational and dumb and improper. When you're trying to stage an intervention for a friend who has a drug problem, your intention should not be to crush them and demean them and enslave them to your will. That's not right. Your intention should be to get them to see how their actions are harming themselves and others out of love so that they reform their behavior. So this is what it would mean to have a virtue. If you have a virtue, you're going to respond appropriately with what life throws at you. And this is not something you're born with, this is something that we have to work on. Now, in some sense, there is an objective way that you should be living so that you can cultivate the virtues and so that you can have a flourishing life. Humans objectively require a good, varied diet in order for us to be healthy, psychologically and physically, right? If you eat Cheetos all day forever, that's not going to be good for you. Similarly, humans require some sort of proper sleep schedule. You can't go your life without sleeping. That is not going to be good for you. You need to do that if you want to achieve a flourishing life. Sleep. Similarly, if you want to achieve a flourishing life, you have to have some sort of exercise routine that keeps your muscles and your body in shape. Otherwise, they will atrophy. You'll become weak. You won't be able to do stuff. You won't feel good. So there are certain objective things that we should be pursuing. Good diet, good sleep, good exercise regimen. Those are all things that we should be seeking after as human beings. All things that we require in order to live a flourishing life. But that doesn't hold across the board. We all have different goals and desires and capacities. Some people in here want to be artists. Some people want to be the next best wrestling phenomenon in the WWE. Some people want to become chess grandmasters. Depending in part on those things, your life should look a little differently compared to other people. For example, if you are good at chess and you like chess and that brings you happiness, you should be spending some amount of time practicing your chess skills and playing chess. It wouldn't make sense for you to spend all your time playing World of Warcraft if you're trying to become a chess grandmaster. Similarly, if you're trying to become a wrestler, champion wrestler, it wouldn't make any sense for you to play chess all day, every day, and not do anything else. it is virtuous for Michael Phelps to eat 10,000 calories in the morning because he needs that energy to train and make his body stronger and improve his swimming skills. It would not be virtuous for you to eat 10,000 calories every morning, right? You're not working as hard as Michael Phelps. You don't have his physique. You don't have his goals. So our lives are going to look a little bit different depending on our goals and desires. It's going to be a little relative, but there are some things that we should all be seeking because we are human beings, and human beings just need some things objectively in order to be happy, healthy, and good. To use one final example, if you care about winning Mr. Universe, you should be in the gym, right? Working out, making your muscles big. It wouldn't make sense for you to be reading philosophy endlessly. So does this make sense? There are some things that we objectively ought to do, and then there are some things that are going to be different from life to life based on what our capacities look like, what we're after, what our life goals are. Now, there are two different kinds of virtues that we should be working on cultivating. We shouldn't just care about making our body fit and in shape. We shouldn't just care about being a moral person. We shouldn't just care about being a smart and wise person. We should be pursuing all of those things. We should be trying to learn more knowledge of the world, learn how to interact in the world, become smarter, and we should be working on becoming a morally good person too. So we should be pursuing the intellectual and the moral virtues, Aristotle says. If you want to become the best version of yourself and achieve a flourishing life, you got to work on all aspects of yourself. This is going to require a lot of time and energy and grit, right? Nobody said this was going to be easy. But if you're after a flourishing life, you got to work on all of this stuff. Now, it may be appropriate for some things to take a back seat to other things sometimes, depending on, how you're doing in these domains. But generally speaking, if we want to achieve eudaimonia, we got to work on ourselves intellectually and morally. How do we do this? Well, that requires two things. It requires a proper education, for example, as to what's good, what's right, what we should be doing in life. But even more importantly, it requires practice and habituation. Because you're not going to live the flourishing life of activity unless you train yourself to live like that. You want to become fit and in shape, you have to habituate yourself to going to the gym. You want to become a good writer, you have to train yourself to write a lot. You want to become a good artist, you have to train yourself to incorporate artistry in your life regularly. If you want to stop spending so much time on your phone, you gotta work on putting the phone down and doing other things. You have to make that a part of your life. So we can become intellectually and morally virtuous through practice and experience, through habit. Because what we do flows from the habits that we've cultivated. Why is it that you brush your teeth before bed? That habit has been ingrained in you since you were a kid. Your parents help instill that in you. And now it's just a part of your life, and you do it, and you don't have to worry about it. You don't have to think about it. It's just a part of what you do. That's what Aristotle's trying to get us to do. is to make these activities that exercise our capacities a part of our everyday routine. Because if we have to have an internal struggle, that's a barrier to improving ourselves and becoming the person that we want to be. Now, one question that you might have is, well, what exactly does this look like? How do I know when I'm being virtuous? How do I know when I'm doing virtuous things, that I'm having the proper reactions? Well, he says that virtuous action proceeds from what he calls a mean state between deficiency and excess. In other words, when you're trying to figure out how to become virtuous, how to think well, speak well, and act well, and human well, you don't go too far in either direction of doing the thing too much or too little, having too much anger or too little anger, giving too much of your money away, not giving enough away. You got to find the happy mean between those extremes. There are a few different virtues that he mentions in this piece, and we can go through a few of them so that this point becomes a little clearer to you. Courage is something that you should work on attaining. What is courage? Does courage mean not fearing anything? You say no. Why? You're right, but does the courageous person fear nothing?
No, but I think it's like overcoming that fear that causes you to have courage.
Exactly. The courageous person doesn't fear nothing. They act despite their fear. So if you're trying to figure out how to become courageous, that means you don't lean too far into cowardice. You don't allow yourself to be afraid of everything. But you also don't rashly rush into every situation without thinking about it. It's healthy and proper to have a certain fear when you have to face down a lion, okay? That is proper. The important thing is achieving a certain balance. To be a courageous person doesn't mean you fear everything. It doesn't mean you fear nothing. It means that you have the proper amount of fear, but you still act even though you have that fear. Or let's look at generosity. Being generous does not mean giving all of your stuff away so that you have nothing and you die on the streets. That's not proper generosity. Neither is proper generosity hoarding everything to yourself and never giving anybody any of your time or energy or wealth. There's a happy middle here. Generosity lies on the mean between these two extremes. And the same thing with honesty. Right? If you're trying to cultivate the virtue of honesty, does that mean you say the first thing that pops into your head to everybody without thinking about it? Oh, hey, how you doing, Melissa? You're looking really fat today. No, that's not proper, right? No, that's not what it means to be honest. Being honest means you're not overly talkative and say everything that comes to your mind, because there's a proper time and place to say certain things. Neither does it mean you lie or keep everything a secret. That's not being honest either. It's somewhere in between these things. Is this intuitive to you? Do you think he's kind of right here? How about friendship? Let's look at friendship. If you want to become friendly and cultivate the virtue of friendliness, what does that look like? Well, that means you're not an ass to everybody. You don't treat everybody like crap. And that doesn't mean you just walk around flattering everybody either. Nobody likes that. That's not being a cool friend. All right? Oh my God, I love your shoes. Oh my God, I love your purse. Oh my God, I love you. Oh my God. It's going to drive people fucking crazy. right? And that's not what it looks like to cultivate a friendship with someone, right? To love bomb them constantly. So, when we're working on ourselves, when we're trying to be virtuous, it's all about finding the proper balance between these extremes in how we think about things, what we do, and how we respond to life. Another way that you could put this is being virtuous has something to do with harmonizing these opposing psychological, moral, and intellectual forces within you. Achieving a kind of balance in the way that you think, speak, and act. This also involves establishing a certain hierarchy of priorities. That's kind of what it's all about. You need to look at life in the proper way. You need to train yourself so that you respond naturally without having to think hard about it or really will yourself to do it. You work on your character so that you respond in the proper way naturally. That's what Aristotle is trying to get us to do. Now, some people think that this philosophy is all about selfishness. All right, it's all about the self. It's all about thinking about yourself and doing what's good for yourself. Aristotle would disagree. Why? Well, as a lot of thinkers have argued throughout history, being in proper relationship with others requires, to some extent, being in proper relationship to yourself. And you might think the opposite is true. Virtue theory, at least according to how Aristotle is conceiving of it, is compatible with both treating yourself properly and treating others properly. Becoming the best version of yourself, in which you have all these virtues, is going to allow you to be good to yourself and others. These aren't mutually exclusive. You're naturally going to do what's right for yourself and others in every situation. So this isn't a narcissistic philosophy. And we've already seen that based on the fact that some of the virtues he talks about are social. And they're based in our relationships with other people. Thus, what Aristotle is pushing us towards is walking down the path of self-reflection and self-improvement. What we should be aiming at is becoming the best versions of ourselves. Why? Not only will we change the world, not only will our relationships be good, not only will we become fast and strong and smart and loving, but because that's going to make us happy. Pursuing the best version of yourself is going to make you happy. And then once you attain the virtues, that's going to allow you to live a flourishing life. Because you're going to do what's right. You're going to respond appropriately to what life throws at you. You're not going to be paralyzed by fear or anxiety or depression. You will naturally treat yourself and others well, doing what's good for yourself and others ultimately. So, to sum up, Aristotle presents for us a life philosophy. Not just a theory on what makes an action right or wrong, but how to become happy, healthy, wise people. Now, in order to do this, there are certain things that you need. For one, he's going to say, you can't do the right things unless you have the right moral education, unless you have the right moral knowledge. So if you're going to become, better morally speaking, you got to know what's right and wrong. You have to have experience in life in dealing with all these situations in which you're faced with a moral dilemma. Why? So you can practice doing the right thing and make it a part of your character. It's what it means to form this virtue, this disposition, making it a part of your character. And then another thing that he says, which students tend to find controversial, is that in order to achieve this flourishing life, you need what he calls some external goods. You need a certain level of freedom, of wealth, of friends, of opportunities. Why? How can you cultivate the virtue of generosity if you have nothing to give? How can you cultivate the virtue of friendship if you don't have any friends and nobody wants to hang out with you? How can you cultivate the virtue of courage if you're never faced with any scary situations? So there are certain things that you're going to need in order to cultivate the virtues. And unfortunately, he would say, not everybody has access to all these things. So the flourishing life is not going to be attainable for them. But you might disagree with that. We can chat about it. So, to kind of encapsulate what Aristotle's trying to get at, it's this. In order to become happy, we need to work on becoming wise and good. Why? Becoming wise and good is going to allow us to do wise and good things for ourselves and for other people. If you're trying to figure out, how to become wise and good, Aristotle would say, well, look at what the wise and good people are doing. Ask questions, do research, work on yourself. In order to do this, we need to have a proper education, and we need to really practice doing the right things, thinking in the right way, responding in the right way. This is not a life philosophy for the faint of heart, because it's one that says, if you want to become happy and healthy and moral, it's something you're going to have to work on. The happy life is not going to fall into your lap. It is, in some sense, your moral responsibility, your own responsibility to attain it. What does this look like? Well, you might say, if you're a psychologist, that it involves doing shadow work. You might say it involves facing your fears, putting yourself in new situations, trying new things out. Most importantly, it involves you doing stuff. You got to do stuff to produce the kind of character that is going to allow you to live a flourishing life. So, what do you think about this view? Here, I'll do that for you. Does this view seem like a good view? Do you like this view? Is anybody convinced? Yeah, I like virtue theory. That's the way to go. Or is it just all bullshit and Aristotle's a dummy? What do you think?
I think it's a good basis to live by, but at the same time, if everyone is doing it, makes it a little difficult.
Okay, say more about that.
It's just a lot of personal responsibility you're holding yourself to, because you're accountable for how you feel and your happiness, which I agree, but I think that it just would be difficult for it to work unless everyone was kind of following it.
Oh, okay, so your worry is that unless we have the proper structures in place and relationships that are a part of our lives, this is hard.
Like, I think it's just very situational. It's like one of those things that's like easier said than done to fulfill all these categories of your life.
Yeah.
At some point, like, other people and constructs do affect you no matter how hard you work on yourself.
Yeah. Aristotle would agree that this is not an easy path. In fact, he may even go further than you in talking about how difficult this is to do. What we get from his philosophy is that there's a strong implication that at any given moment in time, there is a handful of virtuous people alive. And one of the reasons why he thinks that is because he thinks you either have all of the virtues or none of them. Why? Because the virtues depend and inform each other. You can't be generous unless you already know what it means to be courageous with respect to how much money you should give, when, where, etc. You can't be friendly unless you already have the virtue of honesty with yourself and others and how you're supposed to act and treat them. So yeah, Aristotle would say, I don't know, maybe there's like 5 people right now in the world who are virtuous, truly virtuous. But you like the spirit of it? Do you see any problems with it? You brought up one that kind of leads to an issue. Kind of.
I feel like there's a fair amount of people who are really good people and like really try their best to improve the situations and be good, but like that doesn't mean they're happy, or things that they might be experiencing might outweigh that.
Yeah. Okay, so maybe there's an inherent flaw in his guidelines here.
Like if you're a good person and like your whole family gets murdered, but you're virtuous, like that doesn't. You're still gonna be upset, and that's still gonna like cause a lot of issues, and then you have to like redo the whole thing.
Yeah. Well, he would say, again, achieving a flourishing life does not mean you don't feel sadness or anger. It just means that you're doing all that stuff properly. That's what it means to have a flourishing life, is that you're doing it all properly. So he would say, and this is where his conception of happiness differs from us. When we say happy, what we imply is, oh, that person is not sad. Oh, that person is not experiencing heartache. Oh, that person is not having any negative emotion. He would say, no, like if you're living a flourishing life, all of that stuff may be a part of it, depending on the situation that you're in. But what it means to be happy is to be living properly. That's what it is all about. And so I'll leave you with this. While I like the spirit of this view, and it seems like y'all do too, obviously, like utilitarianism and deontology, it does have certain weaknesses. The biggest one, I think, is this. Is this going to help us solve a lot of the problems that we have now? If you go to the Native American family on the reservation and you say, well, look, you know what you need to be happy is you just need to be better. Is that going to help them? Is that going to get them out of their predicament? Probably not. So maybe this view needs to be combined with some other views and attitudes. But I'll leave that up for you to decide. Okay. Thank you for coming. I hope you found this interesting. If you have any questions or concerns, don't hesitate to email me. Otherwise, I will see you all next week, where we'll start looking at ethical issues.